The fluorescent light above booth 7 had been flickering for 3 days, and nobody at the Ridgeline Diner had fixed it yet. Hugh Carver noticed it the moment he sat down, the way he noticed most things, quietly, without comment. He set his jacket on the seat beside him, smoothed it flat, and picked up the laminated menu he already knew by memory. The Tuesday special was chicken pot pie. It was always chicken pot pie on Tuesday. He ordered it anyway, along with black coffee, and turned to look out the window at the gray November sky over Sudbury. He was 53 years old. He had the hands of someone who had spent decades working outdoors, wide across the knuckles, marked with small scars in the places where the cold had split the skin in his 30s. He wore a flannel shirt and work boots, not because he had to anymore, but because he had never once thought to change. The booth vinyl was cracked along the seam. He noticed that too. He was not paying attention to the table by the far wall when the trouble started. He heard it before he looked. A man's voice, loud enough to carry but shaped to sound casual. The kind of voice that wanted an audience without admitting it. "I just think you'd be more comfortable somewhere with, you know." A pause. "More room." Hugh looked up. The woman at the far table was perhaps 45. She had dark hair pulled back, silver-framed glasses, and she was sitting in a wheelchair positioned at the end of the table so she could face the man across from her. The man was younger, late 30s, good-looking in the way that came from money spent on it rather than luck. He had the collar of his coat turned up, and he was scanning the diner with the expression of someone calculating how long they'd have to stay. The woman said something Hugh couldn't hear. The man leaned back. "I looked up this place and it's just... I thought we'd go somewhere better. I made a reservation at Andiamo's. We could still make it." She said something again, still quiet. "Marlene." The man said her name the way people say a word they've already decided means something smaller than it used to. "Come on." Hugh looked back out the window. The pot pie arrived. He ate without hurrying. Outside, a pickup with an Ontario plate was pulling in too fast for the icy lot, fish-tailing slightly before catching. He watched it straighten out. Some habits from a long career were hard to break, even when the career was technically over. "Then I don't know what you want from this." The man's voice again, sharper now. Hugh didn't look up, but the diner had gone quiet enough that he didn't need to. "Declan." The woman's voice, for the first time loud enough to reach him, level. Not angry, but containing something that anger had compressed into a smaller, denser shape. "You called me." "I called because I thought we had things to talk about." "We do, then why?" He stopped, started again, lower. "This isn't what I pictured." "I know," she said. "That's becoming clear." A long pause. The sound of a chair scraping. Hugh looked up just enough to see the man stand, button his coat with 2 quick movements, and pull out his wallet. He set something on the table, a single bill, and walked toward the door without looking back. He had the practiced stride of someone who had learned to leave rooms as a form of punctuation. The door opened. Cold air moved through the diner. Then it closed. Hugh went back to his coffee. He was not going to look. This was not his business. He had driven 40 minutes from his property outside Lively to come here because the food was honest and the booths were deep enough to sit in without feeling crowded, and because Tuesdays were quiet. He had no interest in becoming part of someone else's Tuesday. He was on his second cup when the server, a young woman named Britt, who had worked the lunch shift here for at least 4 years, paused at the far table and said something in a low voice. He heard the word "another" and something else. A moment later, Britt walked past him toward the kitchen with the expression of someone who had seen enough to know what to file it under. Hugh set down his cup. He told himself it was the coffee that made him get up. He walked to the end of the diner and stopped a few feet from the table. The woman, Marlene, had not moved. She was looking at the single bill the man had left, which was a 20, and which was not enough to cover 2 coffees and whatever had been ordered before he arrived. Her hands were folded on the table. She was not crying. Her face had the particular stillness of someone who had decided not to let this place be where they cried. "I don't want to interrupt," Hugh said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark brown and they moved over him quickly in the way people's eyes did when they were trying to figure out whether what was coming next was worse than what had just happened. "You're not," she said. "He left you short." Hugh nodded at the bill. She looked at it. "I noticed. I can let Britt know, if you want." Marlene was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He wasn't worth the drive." "Most of them aren't," Hugh said. though he had very little basis for comparison, having only driven the 40 minutes himself. He said it because it seemed like the honest shape of things. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't categorize. Then something in her face shifted and she said, "Do you want to sit down?" He thought about it. "All right," he said. He sat. Her name was Marlene Okafor. She told him this the way people told you things they had already decided you were allowed to know, without preamble. She'd driven up from Toronto for the date because the man, Declan's, was from here and had suggested it, and she thought meeting halfway was the fair thing to do. She did not say how they'd met. He did not ask. She was a consultant of some kind. She said it vaguely, in the way people did when the real answer was more complicated than the setting called for. Hugh told her his name. He said he lived outside Lively and came here on Tuesdays. He said the pot pie was decent. She looked at the menu and ordered it, and they sat while Britt brought it out. And outside the gray sky was going darker at the edges the way it did in November when the dark came early and without ceremony. "You didn't have to come over," she said, not accusingly, stating a fact. "No," he agreed. Most people didn't. He glanced around the diner, which had mostly returned to its own business. Most people figure it's not their place. Is it yours? He thought about this. "Probably not," he said. "But the man left and you were short on the bill, and I've got enough for 2 pot pies." Marlene looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the least romantic reason anyone has ever talked to me." "I'm not trying to be romantic," Hugh said. "I'm trying to make sure Britt gets tipped properly." And she laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, and it changed her face entirely. She pressed 2 fingers to her mouth afterward as though she hadn't meant to let it out, and then she shook her head. "Hugh," she said, like she was testing the name. "What do you do?" He considered how to answer this. He'd retired from the mining industry 4 years ago, exploration geology, then project management, then a decade sitting on boards he'd been invited onto because people valued his judgment enough to pay for it. He now owned several hundred acres outside Lively and spent most of his time doing exactly what he wanted, which was not much. He grew things, he read. He came to this diner on Tuesdays, he said, "Not much these days." She nodded slowly. She didn't push. He noticed that. They talked for another hour. Not about the man who had left, and not about anything that felt like the preliminary round of a process. They talked the way people sometimes talked in airports, when the flight was delayed and the context stripped away everything except the present moment, easily and without agenda. She had grown up in Hamilton, had a daughter in Guelph, had opinions about the Rideau Canal he found unexpectedly strong for someone who had come from Toronto. He told her about the property, about the stand of white spruce he'd been managing, about the way the lake looked in October before the freeze. She told him about a summer she'd spent in northern BC as a student, doing land surveys for a government contract, and about the moment she'd realized she was not afraid of being alone. "What made you realize it?" he asked. "I was 40 kilometers from the nearest person," she said, "and I thought, this is fine. And then I thought, why did I think that would be the hard part?" Outside, it had started to snow. Not hard, just the first deliberate flakes of the season settling on the hoods of cars in the parking lot. When Britt brought the bill, Hugh paid for both without discussion. Marlene let him, which he appreciated. Some people made paying for dinner into a performance. She was not that kind of person. They stood at the entrance while she arranged her coat and he held the door. "Hugh Carver," she said again, like she was writing it somewhere. "What are you doing this Saturday?" He thought about the fence line he'd been meaning to walk, the spruce, the utter blankness of the calendar that he had spent 4 years constructing with considerable care. "Nothing particular," he said. She handed him a card, small, cream-colored with her name, and a number and 3 letters, after the name that he would look up later and recognize as a designation from the Order of Canada. He drove home in the snow without turning on the radio. He put the card on the kitchen counter and did not call that night, or the next morning. He wasn't certain why. Some old instinct, maybe. The one that had served him well in mining. The instinct that said, wait, observe, don't move until you understand the ground beneath you. Or maybe he just hadn't decided yet what he was deciding. He was 53 years old, and he had learned not to confuse a decision with a feeling. On Thursday, he drove into Sudbury for supplies. At the hardware store, he ran into Daryl Potts, who had worked on his well 2 years back, and who now wanted to talk about a zoning matter. Something about the township wanting to reclassify a corridor of land north of the lake for aggregate extraction. Daryl was worked up about it, the way people got worked up when the thing they were upset about had been building for months and just needed a listener to release it against. "It's the Fentwell application," Daryl said, leaning against the end of the aisle in a way that suggested they'd be there a while. They pushed it through to the committee. Public hearings in 2 weeks, and most people don't even know it's happening. Hugh knew the corridor. He'd walked parts of it years ago before he'd bought his own land. Good boreal mix, a wetland complex, some of the last decent habitat between the highway and the Crown land to the north. "Has anyone filed a formal objection?" he asked. Daryl shook his head. "Barb Lemieux tried, but you know how she is. She doesn't know the right language. They'll ignore it. Who's running the application?" "A company out of Mississauga. Fentwell Resources. They've got a lawyer and a hydrologist and about 100 pages of documents that nobody's had time to read." Hugh nodded. He bought his supplies and drove home. He looked up Fentwell Resources that evening. He looked up the zoning application number, which was publicly filed, and he spent 2 hours reading the 100 pages. He had, in his career, read several thousand pages of documents not unlike these. He knew what they were hiding and what they were burying and where the assumptions didn't hold. On Friday morning, he called the number on the cream-colored card. Marlene answered on the second ring. "Hugh Carver," she said, and he could hear that she was smiling, though he couldn't have explained how. "Saturday," he said. "Are you still in Sudbury?" "I'm back in Toronto until Friday. I could drive up again." "There's a matter I've been looking at," he said. "A land use application. I could use a second opinion." A pause. "You want to talk about a land use application on our second?" She stopped. "I don't know what to call it either," he said. She laughed again, the same surprised sound. "All right, Saturday. Text me the address." She arrived at 11 in a dark blue SUV with Quebec plates and a portable ramp she deployed with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Hugh had the door open and coffee made. She came inside without fuss, looked at his kitchen, the long pine table, the stacks of geological survey maps, the view of the spruce through the back window, and said, "You weren't lying about not doing much." "I told you that at the diner," he said. "Most people who say that are doing plenty of things they don't want to talk about." "I've had my years of those," he said. "I'm done." He had the Fentwell documents spread across the table. She pulled up beside him and put on her glasses and read for 20 minutes without speaking. He refreshed both coffees and did not interrupt. "This hydrogeology report," she said finally. "Yes, the consultant didn't model for seasonal variation, no. If you run the extraction at the rates they're projecting during spring melt, the drawdown reaches the wetland complex," he said. "Within 18 months, 12 by my estimate." She leaned back. "Do you have the consultant's registration number?" He handed her a page. She looked at it, typed something into her phone. A moment passed. He hasn't done a valid hydrogeological assessment in Ontario in 8 years. His certification lapsed. She set the phone down. "Hugh, I know. Who did you file this with?" "I haven't filed it anywhere," he said. "I found it 3 days ago. I don't live here anymore, officially. I don't have standing." "Do you own land in the watershed?" "Yes, then you have standing." She was quiet for a moment. "The public hearing is in what, 10 days? 11. That's enough time to file an expert objection if you move by Monday." She looked at him over her glasses. "Hugh, what exactly is your background?" He hadn't said. He realized he hadn't said any of it, not at the diner, not in the week since, and that she had sat at his table for 2 hours discussing a hydrogeological report without once asking him to justify his competency, because the competency had been evident in the questions he was asking. "Exploration geology," he said. 22 years in the field. Then project management for Borealis Northern for a decade. I left when they went in a direction I didn't agree with. Before I left, I filed the report that got their Kettle Creek application rejected." She was very still for a moment. "The Kettle Creek application," she repeated. "Yes, I sat on the Environmental Review Board for that application," she said, "in 2019, the report that stopped it." She stopped, started again. That was a 600-page document. The technical analysis was cited by 2 universities. "It was," he said. "I had help with the citation formatting." Marlene Okafor looked at him for a long time. She had the expression of someone recalibrating, not upset, not unsettled, but genuinely recalculating the parameters of what she thought she was looking at. "You came over at the diner," she said slowly, "because I was short on the bill. Britt works hard," he said. "And you've been," she gestured at the maps, the documents. "All this time, I stay busy enough." She shook her head, not in disbelief exactly. More the way a person shook their head when the shape of something turned out to be different than they'd anticipated, and they were deciding whether that was better or worse. In this case, Hugh could see that she was deciding it was better, and that she was surprised at herself for not having expected it. "All right," she said. "Let's write the objection." They worked through Saturday afternoon and into the evening. She knew regulatory language the way he knew rock formation. They moved between each other's areas without overlap, without competition. At some point, she called a colleague in Ottawa who specialized in environmental law, and the colleague asked who'd done the hydrogeological critique, and Marlene looked at Hugh, and Hugh said his name, and there was a pause on the line before the colleague said, "I'll clear Monday morning." They ordered pizza at 7. She stayed until 10. When she left, she did not say anything about Saturday being a date or not a date, and neither did he, because neither of them needed to. On Monday, Hugh Carver, Marlene Okafor, and a lawyer named Simone Beauchamp filed a formal technical objection to the Fentwell Resources application with the Township of Nairn and Hyman, and simultaneously with the Provincial Ministry of Natural Resources. The objection was 43 pages. It cited the lapsed certification of Fentwell's hydrogeologist, modeled the seasonal drawdown at 2 different extraction rates, and included 3 independent corroborations from Hugh's former work. Daryl Potts called Hugh on Tuesday evening. "Someone sent a copy of the objection to Barb Lemieux," Daryl said. "She doesn't understand half of it, but she says it's the most official thing she's ever seen." "Good," Hugh said. "Who filed it?" "A few people, Hugh." Daryl's voice went quieter. "Was this you?" "I had help," Hugh said. "Tell Barb the hearing is in 8 days and she should bring people." He hung up. Marlene called that evening. "Simone says Fentwell's legal team has already responded," she said. "They're trying to have the objection struck on procedural grounds. They're claiming your standing is insufficient because the land you own is technically in an adjacent watershed." Hugh had anticipated this. He had looked at the watershed mapping 3 times. "The tributary that crosses my eastern lot line drains into the same receiving body," he said. "It's on the survey, page 41 of the application's own environmental overview." A pause. "You want to call Simone? She has the survey? I'll make sure of it." 2 days before the public hearing, Fentwell Resources withdrew the procedural challenge. Hugh learned this from Simone, who called him at 8 in the morning, and said it with the brevity of someone reporting good news who did not want it to become occasion for celebration too soon. There was still the hearing. There was still the committee. He drove to Sudbury on the evening before the hearing. He had not intended to go inside, had thought he would just make sure the room was findable, the parking adequate. Instead, he walked into the township hall and stood at the back for a few minutes while Barb Lemieux and 4 or 5 others arranged chairs. Barb was a short woman in her 60s who organized with the purposeful energy of someone who had learned to move fast before anyone could tell her not to. She'd printed copies of the objection summary and was distributing them as though they were programs at a concert. She saw him. She stopped. "You're Hugh Carver," she said. "Yes, you wrote the Kettle Creek report." He had not told anyone this. He looked at her. "My nephew worked at Borealis Northern," she said. "He told me years ago. He said you were the one who stopped them." She paused. "Why didn't you say anything when Daryl first told you about this?" "I hadn't read the application yet." She looked at him steadily. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the objection, for reading it first." He drove back to the property. He did not sleep easily, which was not new. He had never slept well the night before a technical review. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Hugh presented the hydrogeological analysis. Simone managed the legal arguments. Marlene, who had driven up that morning, sat beside him at the table and annotated the committee's questions in a notebook before he'd finished answering them. At one point, a committee member, a man named Terrence, who had the look of someone who had hoped this would be resolved before it arrived at him, asked Hugh to explain the seasonal drawdown modeling in terms that weren't technical. Hugh thought for a moment. Then he said, "In plain terms, If this extraction goes ahead as proposed, the wetland north of the corridor will be functionally dry by the time the first grandchild of anyone in this room is old enough to walk to it. The room was quiet. Terrence wrote something down. Marlene did not look at Hugh, but her pen paused for just a moment on the page. Fentwell's representatives spoke for 40 minutes. Their hydrogeologist, whose certification, it had emerged in discovery, had lapsed not 8 years ago but 11. Through a combination of non-renewal and an administrative finding Hugh had located in a provincial database, spoke for 20 of those minutes. He was competent enough to know when a room was not with him, and he finished early. The committee recessed at 4:15. They came back at 5:40. They rejected the Fentwell application by a vote of 5-2. The two who voted in favor did not look at anyone as they stood to collect their papers. Outside in the parking lot, the November air had gone cold and clear the way it sometimes did in the evenings up here, when the wind shifted north and brought down something sharp and honest from across the lake. Darrell Potts shook Hugh's hand with both of his and said something he mostly felt rather than heard. Barb Lemieux hugged Simone and then unexpectedly turned and hugged Hugh, and he accepted it because it would have been worse not to. He walked to his truck. Marlene was beside him. 5-2, she said. 5-2, he said. They stood for a moment in the cold air. She looked at the sky, which was going dark and full of stars the way it did here in November when the clouds moved off. "You never told me," she said, at the diner. "When I asked what you did, you asked what I was doing these days," he said. "I told you not much." She looked at him. "And this came up," he said. He could see she was weighing whether to be exasperated by this or something else. She chose something else. She had, he was learning, a particular talent for choosing something else. "Hugh," she said, "what are you doing for Christmas?" He thought about the property, the spruce, the long quiet weeks he had been planning around nothing in particular. "Nothing I can't move," he said. She nodded. She pulled her collar up against the cold. "I have a daughter in Guelph," she said. "She's been asking to meet the man I've been driving to Sudbury to see." He looked at her. "She's going to ask you what you do," Marlene said. "I want you to tell her the actual answer." "All right," he said. "The whole answer." "All right," he said again. She started toward her SUV, stopped, looked back. "And Hugh? Bring something for the wine. She's particular." He drove home in the dark, the stars sharp and clear above the tree line. The property was quiet when he pulled in. He sat in the truck for a moment without getting out. Through the kitchen window he could see the pine table, the maps still spread across it, the coffee cups from Saturday still draining on the rack. He hadn't moved them. He hadn't meant to leave them, but he hadn't moved them either. He got out of the truck. The cold air came down off the spruce and he stood in it for a moment, looking up at the stars the way he had on 100 nights in 100 northern places, most of them more remote than this, most of them without a kitchen window lit behind him. The fence line could wait until spring.